Every year, since my fiance and I had been dating, which is 6 years, we take a 2-week trip. Me and the fiance like to switch it up. One year it's a nice resort or a cruise, then next, a road trip or camping trip. So last summer, we had it in our mind to get in our SUV, load up our things, the dog, and go across our state to Nevada, see a bit of Nevada, and then on to Northern California. We have rules on these trips. We have to stop at every roadside attraction, and staying at crazy motels or hotels is a must. So, when we discovered there was a clown museum in northern Nevada, in a town called Tonopah, I knew we had to stay there. Well, my fiance hates clowns, like despises them, and that meant we needed to stay there. I made a reservation for one night, and when we got into Tonopah, we dropped the dog off at a friend of ours for the night. I don't remember if they allowed animals, but my friend had a lot of land, and we wanted the dog to run herself ragged and get energy out. So we pull up at this motel, and there are a ton of truckers, some bikers milling around, and my fiancée can handle her own. She's a cop. So I left her in the car while I ran to check in. I figured I would check us in, and then we would get washed up and go to dinner. I go inside to check in, and that is when this big burly lesbian trucker makes her way up to my fiancé. I come out after securing our room key and see she's bent over by the driver's window, wearing her cut-off flannel shirt, Levi jeans, and what looked like a genuine rattlesnake shit-kicker cowboy boot. I saw my fiancé wearing her. I'm trying to be nice, but I am losing my cool face. So I clear my throat so I can get into this vehicle. She turns around, sneering as she looks up at me, with a toothpick in her mouth. She hadn't been to the dentist in quite a while. She says something derogatory, asking if I am satisfying her needs. She cacked her fetid breath in my face, while my fiancé exclaimed that I satisfied her just fine. So she shrugs and saunters over to the group of other truckers. I sigh in relief, and we go to our room. I would like to say that we ended up going to bed, having an amazing night's rest, and waking up feeling amazing in the morning. I'd like to say that, but that isn't what actually happened, is it? No. That night we are in bed, after a round of nocturnal activities. I'm smoking a cigarette mindlessly, shuffling through a few channels, and my fiancé is browsing the web. There's a knock on the door, and we ask who it is, and I hear someone running away from the door. I get out of bed, wrapping a towel around my waist, and stick my head out the door to see no one. After that, there weren't any more knocks, so we went to bed. I woke up early the next day, and as we're pulling out, I notice a semi is following us. I chalk it up to someone pulling out and shrug it off. However, when the semi follows us as we head out to my buddy's farm, we start getting creeped out. It's about a 3-minute turning into my buddy's driveway, and he has a lot of land and a long-ass driveway. When the semi gets so close to the back bumper, it's almost pushing us. My fiancé pulls out the phone to call the police when I swerve into the driveway and book it up to my buddy's house. Meanwhile, the semi stops, the doors open, and 3 truckers get out. 2 big butch lesbians one being my fiance's admirer, and one being a big dude that easily weighed 450 pounds. Luckily, my buddy is a crazy survivalist and gun enthusiast, and he comes running out of his garage with a gun. The fiancé and I are seriously freaking out, and we are getting into the middle of some crazy gunfight when the truckers quickly get in and leave. We were going to dial the police, but my friend assured me they wouldn't bother us anymore. We quickly gathered up our dog and got the hell out of there. My grandfather was a long-haul truck driver. When we'd gather around his house, he would always share his strange and interesting stories of what he had seen on the road. Certainly, a genuinely incredible collection of stories, the best I've ever heard anyway. But the one that always stuck with me and freaked me out the most was the following. According to him, he was driving along a very desolate stretch of road in the middle of the night. He was running comfortably, so there was no rush to his journey at all. Traffic had been favorable, and he was feeling pretty good about himself. He didn't have much more to go, and expected to reach his destination by morning. As fate would have it, with this road being so desolate, he decided to pull up on the side of this barren road and just take in the view and get a bit of fresh air to feel a bit more at ease and awake. So he steps out of his truck, takes a good look around at the wilderness, and pulls out a cigarette from his pocket. He goes to light it up and breathes out a refreshing puff. He's just looking around at nature's beauty, admiring the crisp and beautiful landscape, when all of a sudden he hears someone behind him. There's a man. My grandfather is immediately on edge. Like I said before, this was a completely barren and desolate stretch of road in the absolute middle of nowhere. He gets spooked, but tries to be rational. Perhaps the person had just pulled up a few moments before, and my grandfather hadn't noticed him behind him. And maybe he was just lonely and wanted a chat. This person asks for a cigarette, and my grandfather hands one over. Oddly enough, he didn't ask for a lighter. He just holds it in his hand. My grandfather, feeling pretty awkwarded out, wanted to make small talk, so asked where the guy was heading. The guy gave some vague and ambiguous answer, and gave my grandfather vibes that he wasn't really interested in sharing personal information. So my grandfather at that moment just starts making a few steps towards the edge of his truck, because he wanted to see this guy's car. He was curious as to why he hadn't seen it before. So while still keeping conversation with the guy, he's just walking off to the side to get a good enough angle to see behind his truck. When he looks, he sees nothing. So then he assumes maybe he's parked next to him on the side that wasn't visible. After about 5 minutes of conversation, my grandfather realizes that although he did have a little bit of time to kill, he really should be on his way, although the gentleman did seem nice enough. So he bids the gentleman good night and starts to move towards the door of his truck. The gentleman then goes the other way and makes his way towards where my grandfather assumes is his vehicle. A tinge of curiosity sparks within him, and he goes to peek at this guy's car. But when my grandfather goes to see, there's nothing, and the man has vanished. My grandfather is beyond profoundly freaked out. He doesn't get back in his truck. Being a rational man, he starts to wonder, what if he'd been underneath the truck, even though that was incredibly unlikely. So he looks underneath, checks the wheels, checks the back, checks everywhere. No sign of the man. There's no way he could have made it to the roof. My grandfather would have heard it. In the eerie quiet after all. As my grandfather drives away, he looks in his mirrors to see if he hadn't have just missed it. And of course, he hasn't. There's no one there, and there's nothing there. Whenever he told me this story, he would always go quiet for a little bit after. This is without a doubt the most freaked out he'd ever been, because he was completely unable to rationalize the situation as to who the guy was, how he got there in the first place, and how he seemingly managed to evaporate into the nothingness after. On this night, my ex, a type A personality and aggressive driver, and I were making a 15-hour drive straight through from the Midwest to Texas. He never let me take the wheel or sleep, so the more exhausted he became, the worse the trip. By the time we'd reached Texarkana, it was 3 a.m. We hadn't seen another vehicle in an hour, and his nerves were on my nerves. Ahead of us were finally dim taillights. Pulling within a couple of car lengths, we see a semi. Even though there were no other cars around, my ex makes an unnecessarily violent swerve to the left to pass. I screamed what the hell when he jerked right behind the semi again. He started off on one of his rants, something about another truck. Right beside our driver door, like a foot, was another semi. Inside our car was a madhouse, as these two semis boxed us in out of nowhere. My ex is having a screaming gesture, having a proper fit. I get a close look at the driver, right beside us. Damned if he didn't look like a young Charles Manson. Wild, dark hair, crazy eyes, and cackling. I was glad I couldn't hear. But something was off. Or even more off. The wild-eyed trucker was filming my ex ranting on an old camcorder. I laughed hard, and the ex wasn't amused. I said, "That driver does this for kicks, don't you get it?" My ex still sees no humor. I bet you anything that we're going to show up on a tape at his next party, along with anyone else he'd got. The driver pulled ahead, and out of sight, when he saw me laugh. Of course, my ex bitched the rest of the way there. And that's why he's the ex.